mentally we get to move on to new territory. And I think that's exciting if you're kind of someone that's stuck in the past or kind of like wants to move forward. That's what this is exciting for. Good morning, everybody, and welcome back to the Astrology Report, this time for February 6th through February 12th of 2023. Before I get going into the week, I just want to preface this one thing. Now that we're in February, I've said this plenty of times before. Most astrologers are saying this too. March and April really are the craziest months of this year. When we get to March, it's going to be March, April, May, June, July, August, where all of these significant changes are happening. This is the calm before the storm. And I say that both as a preface to like, there's going to be some crazy things happening, but also take a moment to acknowledge the time that you're in, right? Something that I love about astrology that I've said is like, it's like a time honoring exercise. Things are going to be changing very soon. If you're in a position where you're wanting things to change and you hate where you're at, you just have to be patient. There is so much change happening for the rest of this year, and you might want to be careful what you wish for, but let's go ahead and get started into the week. But first, remember, we have 2023 calendars available for you. We have a day sect version and a limited edition night sect version in Latin. These are my favorite 2023 calendars. If you use coupon code at checkout, Cam White in just one word, you'll save 10% off. These posters are absolutely beautiful. They're really, really high quality. They're absolutely amazing. They're my favorite. This is why I'm doing this collaboration, because I actually really like these posters. So we're starting this week off on Monday, February 6th, with the moon at late degrees of Leo, making an opposition to Saturn. It will then go into Virgo, and on the same time, Mercury is going to be sextiling Neptune. So the thing is with this, and don't mind me looking at my computer screen here because my Weatherman TV still is not working. So I don't know what to do about that. But anyway, the thing is here, we're still in this Mercury shadow period, right? Mercury leaves shadow technically tomorrow on Tuesday. However, Mercury making the sextile to Neptune, it's not, again, I've said this plenty of times before, it's not really the biggest deal in the world. And you have to take it with context, right? I want you to think about what was happening when Mercury first sextiled Neptune and went retrograde. This would have been about the end of December of 2022. What area of your chart did Mercury retrograde in? You know, did it retrograde in your third house, your fifth house, your ninth house, whatever it was? What did you have some delays in? Where did you have some miscommunications? Where did you have to rethink or re-strategize things? Where did you have to come up with a new game plan? And as Mercury made a sextile to Neptune, Neptune is a very creative planet, right? I do give Neptune a very hard time because honestly, when we are in a world that is completely engulfed in media and that media distorts, what the truth is, I find Neptune to be much more a malefic planet at the moment. But there are creative parts to it, right? Like, when you go and you watch your favorite movies, or even, like the level of cinematic editing on TikTok is insane nowadays, with Neptune now getting ready to leave Pisces versus when social media first began, when Neptune entered Pisces. So what I'm trying to get at here is it's a very creative planet. It kind of gives you this illusion of what things can be. And I just want you to think of when Mercury first stationed retrograde at sextile Neptune, was there this vision, this image that you had in your head that you kind of had to replan and get back into? Because as Mercury sextiles Neptune here on Monday, this is kind of going back to that plan. This is kind of going back to that vision that you first originally had when Mercury went retrograde at the very end of December. And we had all of January of Mercury retrograde, and then stationed direct like the third week of January. And now we're getting ready to have it leave shadow. But as Mercury is here, sextiling Neptune, just stepping more into that vision, stepping more into that creative, like what are the things to come? How do you want things to look? Can you, this is the fun part about art, is taking something that's in your head and laying it out in the world, making it a reality. And the Neptune part is the part of it that's in your head. Like lately, I've been having some really crazy dreams, and I've been trying to literally make art with some of it, not like art that I'm going to publish or anything like that, but just kind of like really putting, pen to paper as far as like what I'm seeing in my head. And I find that is just like a very Neptunian thing of like, let's take this distorted, weird image and what does it look like in real life? How can I relate that to real life? So on Monday, there's just this nice little boost, and I think in creative process, creative thinking. Mercury's still in Capricorn, so we're still, there's a plan that we have set in. We had to change those plans, and now that we're fully moving in with those plans, that vision's starting to become a lot more clear. It's starting to become a lot more realistic. But on Monday, the moon's going to be at the late degrees of Leo, making an opposition to Saturn. and I believe I said this last week. I know I've been saying it over on my Patreon where I do monthly rising sign horoscopes. There's a few people that came onto the Patreon that were like, I didn't know that you did rising sign horoscopes every month. Yes, I do rising sign horoscopes every month, and Ask Me Anything live streams, and also monthly overview live streams. So if you're interested in that, go ahead and go to the Patreon, support the channel. But what I wanted to say was, we're at the last degrees of Saturn in Aquarius. We're almost done. Saturn does not go back into Aquarius for another 30 years. That's not going to be until like 2050 something. So it's one of those things where you have to kind of enjoy it for what it is, right? Like the past 2.5 years of Saturn in Aquarius are very hard. And we're at a point where you have to accept it, enjoy it, and really ask, like, what did you learn through this experience, right? Like nothing lasts forever, even the most hardest times, but there's no point into going through something rough and difficult in your life without gaining a lesson from it. Like you can go through something very horrible in life and it can just weigh on you forever. And there's no need to do that. Versus if you go through something horrible in life and you learn something from it, you can extract value from it, right? And that can turn into a lesson. That can turn into a better way of living. And I'm saying this because the moon's in Leo here making this opposition to Saturn. And as I've said for, like 2.5 years, that moon in Leo is like really wanting that attention, really putting like your pride out there, really kind of putting a little bit of your ego, right? Like our moon's in Leo, it's kind of like, I want to be seen, I want to be witnessed, I want to be, represented. But it's opposite Saturn in Aquarius. There's this difference between the individual and the group. There's this difference between your needs and everybody else's needs. And now that we're at the tail end of that, there's this kind of like, ask yourself just, what have you gone through in terms of maybe, seeking other people's validation, seeking a, community or a tribe to really subscribe to? And where have you kind of just learned to create it yourself? Where have you learned to have better boundaries with how you let the crowd or let people's, opinions, affect you? And so I think as the moon goes opposite Saturn on Monday, there is this level of, again, not necessarily liking, like wanting to be seen, but not getting that, the feeling that you want from it, maybe feeling a little bit more criticized. So and this is that waning moon, right? We're just coming off that full moon in Leo. So not everyone's going to like what you do, right? Like, but that's not for, them. It's not for you to care about what they think. It's about, are you doing the thing that you need to do? So then after that, the moon's going to go into Virgo. And I like this moon in Virgo transit. Like this is a waning moon in Virgo. Again, cleaning things up, clearing things out, getting yourself organized. And now that it's a waning mood, just coming off from the full moon in Leo, it's like full moon in Leo. This is what I want. This is who I am. And it was square Uranus. So it was very disruptive. And now the moon's in Virgo where it's kind of like picking up the pieces, but not necessarily like, maybe kind of picking up the pieces. Like I kind of think of it as like, when you're at a rave and, when the headliner comes on and they shoot all the, glitter and the, sparkles or whatever the fuck they shoot out. And then afterwards, the cleanup crew has to come in and clean all that up. That's like the waning moon in Virgo after the full moon in Leo. That's actually a really good analogy. But what I like about it is it's like, once there's this realization, once there's this feeling that kind of arises and that kind of snaps, right? That full moon in Leo snap that we had, it's kind of like, all right, it's time to get organized. It's time to get clear. It's time to get a little bit more into the details. We go into Tuesday, and the moon, as it's in Virgo, is going to square Mars, and it's going to go opposite Venus. Wow, I spelled opposite wrong. Whoops. Mercury leaves shadow on Tuesday, and Venus is going to sextile Uranus. You like this Mercury leaving shadow glyph I did with the shadow? I thought it was pretty cool. I do what I can. So Tuesday looks frustrating in some regard on an emotional level, but the exciting part about this is Mercury's finally leaving shadow. Mentally, we are moving on to new territory, right? That's the thing of the Mercury shadow period. Like once Mercury's in shadow, before it retrogrades, all of the themes of the retrograde come up, right? Like what's going to go wrong, what you have to redo, what you have to rethink. Then Mercury goes retrograde. And that's when it's like the delay happens. Something happens that you have to move a little bit backwards on. Mercury stations direct where you go, okay, this is what the solution is going to be. And then that Mercury shadow period is just addressing the problem, working the solution. And Mercury is again about our minds, about communication, our rational thoughts. What are we planning? And as Mercury finally leaves shadow, it's like finally mentally we get to move on to new territory. And I think that's exciting if you're kind of someone that's stuck in the past or kind of like wants to move forward. That's what this is exciting for. But Venus also sextiles Uranus, which is a highlight of this week. And it's just a sextile, so it's not, the biggest bang in the world, but it's an exalted Venus sextiling Uranus in her home sign. Like, this is kind of a nice, innovative breakthrough with, pleasure and connection and fun. But I want to talk a little bit about the moon, because the moon, while it's here in Virgo on Tuesday, is going to first square Mars. And again, we have Mars in Gemini. We want to do this. We want to do that. We're going here. We're going there. Then the moon in Virgo making that square to Mars is kind of like overwhelmed. I really can't stand the term neurodivergence that everybody uses, because it's like, well, anyone literally could be labeled that. And so how much does that label really help anybody? But it's easy to get, with the mutable signs, overwhelmed, right? They're all about changing and adapting. And if you're someone that is like, I'm super neurodivergent and I can't focus, there's some things that you should do in your life to help do that. It's not just like you're born that way. You can easily fix and change that. But this is one of those days where you're probably going to struggle a little bit more. That's what I'm trying to bring up here. The moon in Virgo wants us to, analyze, detail. And what's important about the moon is this is kind of like our emotions, right? Like day to day, how we're feeling. And feelings change. They come and go. But when you are in a situation that's like right there in your face, that's, super immediate, it's easy to get those emotions stoked up. And as the moon's in Virgo, where we're wanting to be detailed and wanting to be organized, it's squaring Mars in Gemini, where it's this distraction. It's like, well, for example, let's say you've got all these things to do in your life, right? Like we all do, but your room's dirty, so you want to pick up your room. This is like one of those days where it's like, I need to clean my room, but I can't put this off anymore, and I need to do that, but I have to do this to make my space better. It's like, if you're, when your space is just like messed up and crappy, it's like not motivating to do anything, versus when you have a clean space, it's very motivating. This moon in Virgo squaring Mars is it's just frustrating, because it's going to be hard to focus and it's going to be hard to prioritize, right? Now, what is nice though, is that after this moon squares Mars on Tuesday, where there is this kind of, frustration, this distraction, the moon's then going to go opposite Venus, where I think the question really is like, are you killing the vibe? How can you have fun with this, right? As the moon's in Virgo and we're wanting to be more detailed and we're wanting to be more organized, it's at an opposition, right? So it's at odds. It's 180 degrees different from Venus and Pisces. And Venus and Pisces is just like, let's just relax and let's, take a bath, or let's, Venus and Pisces is very, Venus and Pisces reminds me of like melted chocolate. Like there's no form, it's just oozing, and it's oozing deliciousness, if that makes sense. And the moon in Virgo is kind of like, this chocolate's melted. I have to clean it all up and it's not good. Which, of course, in my head, after I said that, I was like, oh, yeah, you don't want melted chocolate, everywhere. But I think as the moon's opposite Venus, don't let that like moon square Mars ruin your fun. And I think there's a way to have fun with what you're doing, right? Like if you're just like, oh my gosh, like my room is so dirty, and I'm using the dirty room analogy because it's so simple. Most of us, like a very few of you are going to have your spaces super duper 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 clean and be anal about it. Most people are going to have, varying levels of messiness. But it's easy to have a mess and feel so overwhelmed with it. Like if you ever watch the Hoarder Show, it's like they get so overwhelmed with it that they just put it off. It's so daunting and so overwhelming that like I can't even do that, because that's going to require me to, take personal inventory and be like, why did I let this happen? I'm not good enough. I suck and I deserve, all of the shitty things that have happened in my life. And then you just spiral out of control. And there's no need for that, but that's just what we do. With the moon in Virgo opposite Venus and Pisces, how can you have fun doing it? Like for me, when I like cleaning, it's like I put on my music or I put on a podcast, I burn some incense, and I go to town and I try to have more fun with it. I try to make it a pleasurable experience. But the other end of the moon in Virgo opposite Venus and Pisces is it's kind of like when you're too worried about the specifics, it ruins the vibe of everything else, right? Like think of art. Like, and of course there's varying different types of art out there, but like if you are, let's say, I talk about music production stuff. Sometimes with music production, it is important to get into the details and to get in the nitty gritty. But other times, what might be a mistake, like I was just listening to, what's his face from Aerosmith. He was talking about the beginning of Sweet Emotion. And one of the sound effects at the beginning of the Sweet Emotions, where it goes like, bow, wow, like that. He was talking about that part and how something broke in the middle of recording that, but they kept the sound because it sounded cool. And that's like this moon in Virgo opposite Venus and Pisces. Like, okay, something could break and go, oh no, this is broken. Why me? Spiral, spiral, spiral. Or you can just be like, oh, that actually kind of sounded cool. Let's keep that in there. That's fun. You know what I mean? So that's the thing with these, you know, mutable signs. You have to kind of go with it. You can't just be like, because the mutable signs are all about change. And if it's like, well, this isn't good enough, so let's change that. Well, that's not good enough. Let's change. It's like sometimes things just kind of happen and you have to say, all right, that is what the change is. We're going to move on from here. But Mercury leaves shadow on Tuesday. So we're finally thinking about something else. We're finally moving on mentally. Yes, Mercury is moving its way towards Pluto. So there is this kind of power and fear and corruption thing kind of going on where it can kind of be angsty, but we'll talk about that later. But Mercury's leaving shadow. Mentally, we're moving on to something else. We're moving on with our plans. We have finally wrapped up whatever the hell we had to wrap up, and we can move on. But Venus sextiles Uranus also on Tuesday. And this goes back into that Aerosmith analogy that I used. There is some sort of creative spark of innovation here, and it might be a happy accident. And so this is one of those things where, you know, this would be easier to deal with if the moon wasn't in Virgo, opposite Venus and squaring Mars, where because the moon's squaring Mars and opposite Venus, it's I think you could overthink it and not see the value in it, right? Like rather than being like, oh, I messed up this doesn't sound good enough. How could you look at it and think of it as, oh, well, that was weird, but I actually kind of like how this is. I kind of like what's happening here. So Venus when you're talking about music, pleasure, fun, it's sextiling Uranus. There's some type of innovative spurt of, you know, disruption that is a happy accident. I think that's the best way to look at Venus Uranus aspects is happy accidents. You know, maybe Venus squaring Uranus is kind of like wanting to do something better and then it like doesn't work out. But Venus sextile Uranus is definitely a happy accident. So Tuesday's looking pretty fun for a Tuesday, even though Tuesdays have no feeling. We get to Wednesday. The moon, now getting towards the later degrees of Virgo, is going to go opposite Neptune and trine Mercury. So again, this is why I like this moon and Virgo transit. I really love when we're in like the Capricorn energy stuff where we're very like business, and numbers. And we get like moon and Virgo transits where it's like relaxing to like, go over the details. It's relaxing. Like I always think of people who are into like model stuff, like model trains or like little tiny art characters where they like paint the little tiny things. Like that's very moon and Virgo of just like relaxing in a very detailed way. But as the moon goes opposite Neptune and trines Mercury, the one thing is as the moon's opposite Neptune, you kind of have to like make sure you know what you're looking at. Like, have you ever, let's say you had an art project and you were like, oh, this is what I'm seeing, but you know, you weren't actually seeing it clearly enough. This is one of those days to kind of take a step back and just say, what is in front of me? Like, let's say you're working on a very elaborate art piece. I'm staring at my like little platform thing here and you're getting so worked into the details. Oh, here's an example, a puzzle. Let's say you got like 1,000-piece puzzle and you're like, oh, where's this? And where's this piece go? And where's that piece go? Sometimes you have to just take a big step back and be like, what is this big picture and where are these pieces supposed to go? And where are these general pieces supposed to go? I think Wednesday is a good day to kind of take a step back and make sure you're looking at everything the right way. Because I think if you're too lost in the weeds and the details with that opposition to Neptune, it's just going to become blurry. Like I just saw this 1,000-piece puzzle on like TikTok or whatever. And it was just like, it was all one color, but it was that material where if you kind of bend it in the light, it changes colors, but it was all one color. And it looked really hard to do. And this is one of those things where if you get too lost on trying to just place the one little, you know, puzzle piece in the one little section, sometimes you have to take a step back and be like, let's look at this whole thing in a bigger picture. And how can that help me get more clear about where I specifically need to put my energy? And then after the moon goes opposite Neptune, it's going to make this trine to Mercury, where there is this kind of solution where it's like, okay, maybe I just needed to take a step back, maybe re-go over my inventory, maybe re-go over, you know, like do what you can, right? And as that moon trines Mercury, I think there is this solution that gets involved. There is this kind of mental clarity that hits. And there's not much more to say about that. I think as the moon's trining Mercury too, this is clear lines of communication. These are earth signs. This is very, you know, tangible material things. That's why I kind of like the puzzle analogy here. But Mercury is now out of shadow. And as the moon's in Virgo, yes, it'll be opposite Neptune. So there will be this kind of moment of like, what am I fucking looking at here? Like I'm getting too lost in the details. I'm staring too close to the screen. Maybe just taking a step back and having a moment of clarity. So I like Wednesday for that. We move to Thursday. The moon is then going to ingress into Libra, and it's going to make an opposition to Jupiter. I spelled opposite correctly this time. And then it's going to trine Mars. I like Thursday. Thursday is where everything is going to get kind of balanced out a little bit. Thursday, moon ingresses into Libra. Everything's feeling a lot more airy, if that makes sense. Like we have the sun and Saturn still in Aquarius, Mars in Gemini, and now the moon going into Libra. When you talk about the air signs, you're talking about ideas. You're talking about communication. You're talking about like the fire signs are like your passion. And there's a lot of actual traditional text in astrology that relates fire signs to emotion, which makes more sense, right? You think of like crime of passion, or you think about like anger or love and sex. Like it's a very passionate, flamboyant thing versus, and that's not to say that like water doesn't rule emotion, but there's just two types of it, right? Water is going to be much more, liquid. Water is going to be much more, almost material in a sense. Like we're literally just sacks of water almost in a sense. And, Earth's going to be like the tangible, the physical, and air is going to be much more of like the ideas that surround us, the ideas that fixate things, I'm going to be making a podcast about my predictions for Saturn and Pisces. It's going to be a little intense because, well, the next few years are going to be really intense, but I've been thinking a lot about money. And eventually here, the U.S., the dollar is going to collapse. Yes, I know the dollar is really strong right now, but fiat currencies always break down. If you don't know what a fiat currency is, because this is stuff that I didn't know until I got into this because I wanted to know, but pretty much most currencies have always been backed up by something, typically gold. But back in the 70s or the 60s, Richard Nixon, pretty much the U.S. dollar is backed by gold. All of these countries were backed by the U.S. dollar. But then America was printing too much money, and all these other countries were like, hey, America's printing more money, more dollars right now than we know that there's gold. So they were on their way to come get gold from us. And Nixon was like, oh, we're actually not on the gold standard anymore. Fiat currency for everybody, which pretty much means money is, and the value of the dollar is literally imaginary. It's literally made up. This is why they can just print dollars. And I mean, there's repercussions for it, but that's why they can just print dollars, right? Because it's literally imaginary. That's pretty much what fiat means. And that's so funny because Mercury has triplicity. Well, Mercury rules Gemini, but Mercury is going to gain triplicity in Aquarius. I believe it's the night triplicity. I can't remember. But anyway, Mercury does really well in the air signs because, Mercury rules Gemini. And also Mercury rules money. When you get into like fractional reserve banking, which is kind of like, if a bank has, 100 accounts that each have like $1,000 and they have $100,000, well, no one's all going to take that money. So they can lend out $500,000 because it's all numbers and it's easy to lie about them. But Mercury rules money because it's also commodity and trading and stuff like that. I'm kind of going off on a tangent here, but I've been thinking a lot about money and this air sign idea of just the air of like how many ideas, how many things in society are controlled by our literal imagination, right? There's other examples that I know you could probably imagine that I could talk about. But there's so many just these random ideas that hold us down to society that, I mean, with Saturn and Aquarius, we've seen these literal ideas divide us, and they're stupid ideas for the most part. Like they have no basis in reality. They're just this ideology that, is used to control. And the whole reason I'm bringing this up is when we get to this air sign stuff, we get to connect with that part of the world that is focused on the intangible, that is focused on the ideas that float around society that control us, right? And so as the moon goes into Libra, there's much more of this focus on, right? It's the moon. So we're talking about our emotions. We're talking about Libra. We're talking about relationships, balance, fairness, justice. That's something I really like about Libra. Libra's got a lot going on. It's like Venus rules it. Mars is in detriment, exalted by Saturn, triplicity of Mercury. There's quite a lot going on with Libra. A lot of planets have a lot of say-so in there, which is interesting because I used this analogy before of Saturn is exalted in Libra, and you think of relationships, right? Like Venus is not all about relationships. Well, I take that back. Venus rules Libra, right? So relationships are about love and connection. But with Saturn exalted there, it's like, well, it takes commitment. It takes rules. It takes, discipline. There's this sort of, authority that has to kind of intervene in some kind of way. And so as the moon goes into Libra, we are kind of focused on that part of relationships that's much more about like our emotional connection. And it is going to eventually be trining the sun and trining Mars. So there's going to be a lot of communication and ideas shared. But the moon's first going to go opposite Jupiter, where Jupiter, which, by the way, last week I said that Jupiter's leaving shadow this week. It's actually not. It's next week. Sorry about that. But the moon is going to go into Libra and opposite Jupiter and Aries. And Jupiter and Aries is very like our beliefs, our faith, our hope, where we find optimism is very locked in step with, our ability to take action, our confidence, our ability to literally enact in that spark. That's what Aries was. It's like that spark. And the moon in Libra going opposite Jupiter and Aries is like, for example, sometimes it's appropriate to just kick down the door and be like, what the fuck is up? I'm here. Do something about it. But there's other times where you kind of have to have some, manners. You have to, politely roast people. Like Jupiter and Aries is like roasting almost, but moon and Libra is like a slight underhanded roast, a very non-confrontational roast. And that doesn't mean you can't be Jupiter and Aries. You just have to be smooth with it. You have to be smooth operator. That's the song I was thinking of. Anyway, the moon will go into Libra opposite Jupiter and Aries. Be a smooth operator, right? Hey, I want to do this, but I don't need to just be like just kind of like, that'd be smooth about it. Come on. So the moon will go opposite Jupiter. What was the other thing? Oh, and then it's going to be trining Mars. So be smooth about what you want to confront. And this is Jupiter and Aries, right? Like, what are you wanting to create? What are you wanting to start and begin? I've talked so much about this Jupiter and Aries transit being so important because this is where everything's happening over the next few years. 2025, 2026, eclipses are happening right here. Saturn, Neptune is happening right here. Venus retrograde, Mercury retrograde, all right here. So everything that you're kind of starting off right now is all going to come full circle here at about 2025 and 2026. So this is why I've been saying with Jupiter and Aries, what are you creating? What are you starting? What are you initiating? And I think as the moon's in Libra opposite Jupiter, it's like, you don't have to just full force go for it, but how can you be smooth about it? How can you still do that, but with a balance involved? And the moon's in Libra, and it's going to make a trine to Mars, where Mars and Gemini's, a lot of the yapping, being angry about this, being angry about that, kind of being distracted. But what I do like about the moon in Libra, and both sides of the spectrum of where you fall on any given topic right now, it's nice to find someone to just kind of like whine and bitch about things with. Like, you ever just kind of annoyed of society and where everything's going? And this is so true for both sides, right? Like, you could be super hardcore leftist, super, Republican or whatever. And it's just like, sometimes it's just nice to bitch and complain about the state of the world with people. And the moon in Libra trining Mars and Gemini is very much that, like sharing, connecting with the relationship and sharing our issues. Mars and Gemini. What's this about? What, the budget, healthcare, and, that kind of stuff. But the other way I look at it is, with the moon trining Mars, going with the opposition to Jupiter, is like, okay, if you want to do something and you don't have that energy to just charge and go for it all the way, what can you do? What do you have the motivation to do, right? Like, if you have a big stuff of things to do on your list, maybe you don't need to go in order. Maybe you just need to prioritize. Well, I mean, there is a level of prioritization that has to happen, but like, maybe there's like a very like numbers oriented thing. And then there's maybe a very creative thing. And then there's maybe another just task oriented thing. Maybe you're like, I don't want to do these two things. I just want to do busy work. Let me just do tasks. It's like, what do you have the energy for right now that could still get you on your way of doing stuff without, feeling like you're in this daunting mode of having to do everything all at once? So the moon in Libra, you just got to be balanced with it, right? It's not about, if I'm not, I either have to do everything on my list or I can't do anything at all. Just do one fucking thing. Just do one. It's not that hard. And you'll feel great after you do that one thing. We get to Friday, Mercury conjoins Pluto. The reason I'm kind of like this is like, look, imagine this is December 2019, and I was telling you, these next 3 months, you're going to see the world change. You'd be like, yeah, that's what every astrologer says. We're going through a portal and the world's changing. There's going to be a lot of information and a lot of things changing. Like, I've already said this in a few places, but there's going to be a new war front in Europe. That's happening. You're going to see, debt probably spiral. We're going to a recession. Things are going to look pretty fucking bad. And I don't say that to be like a doomsdayer kind of thing, but just like, this is the reality. And the reason I bring this up with Mercury conjoining Pluto is we have Mercury, the messenger, on top of the planet of corruption, which this is so funny to me about people is Pluto at 20, it's at 28. It's going to be at 29 degrees Capricorn here for like the next month. Every institution is corrupted. I don't care what your beliefs are. I don't care if you think this side is corrupted, but we can have faith in this. No. It's all corrupted. It's all bad. Everything is so corrupted. And you can't look at, like, if you're still looking at, for example, this war in Ukraine as Ukraine are the good guys and Russia's the bad guys, and we have to put everything we possibly can in defeating them, you're not seeing the full picture here, and you're not actually realizing what energy you are giving to the situation. None of this helps anybody. And that's not saying I support Russia invading Ukraine. That's not saying that I think war is good or anything like that. But you have to understand, this is not a virtue war of we're the good guys and Putin bad. This is the military-industrial complex that owns all of the politicians, and they will kill every last Ukrainian to make a couple billion. That's war. That was true for Iraq. That was true for Syria, which we're still in Syria. We just also saw Israel put drones in Iran. That's going to be a conflict that comes up here in the next few years. That was true, again, in Iraq. That's going to be true in all the South American countries. This is the world that we live in, especially if you live in America. And the whole reason I'm kind of going off on this tangent is with Mercury conjoining Pluto, I'd be really interested of what gets announced. I'd be really interested in what insight we get into with the Pluto stuff, with the corruption stuff. Like some people were saying, I've gotten people on my Patreon, I think this was one of the questions on my last Ask Me Anything episode of, do you think, politicians use astrology because they just do things at the same time? And it's like, I think there's a big misconception that there's some astrologers like, oh yeah, politicians use astrology. I don't really think so. I think maybe a very small handful might be interested in it. I know I have clients that are in that sphere, but it's not on the way that you think. And when you talk about politicians, I mean, you're talking about like senators, like is literally comes from the word Saturn, old people. I don't know if you know that, but when you talk about Pluto, like a lot of these actors are like, Pluto is the thing that symbolizes the governments right now. When we saw Pluto ingress into a Capricorn, what did we see? We saw the biggest bank bailout. Rather than bailing out the American people, we bailed out the banks, and then we turned into quantitative easing where it's just flushing the banks with cash for cheap debt, to just overload. And then we saw the military industrial complex take things over. That's how we got, into, Syria, more Afghanistan stuff, all that stuff. Anyway, I'm saying all of this because as Mercury conjoins Pluto, if you don't pay attention to the news, you're living a way better life than most people. Don't pay attention to the news. But if you do, I'd be really interested as what insight we get peeked into. What kind of, and this isn't maybe not necessarily an announcement, but this is we get a little bit of insight as to what's going on behind the closed doors, right? Pluto rules the underworld and Mercury's there. The messenger has a message from the underworld. And I want you to think about this in your own personal life. Where are your fears? Where are you corrupted? And this isn't to say that you're a bad person, but we're all, sinners at the end of the day. We all do things that aren't good for us. And maybe this would be a good time to check yourself of like, where am I in the wrong? Where am I, thinking corruptedly? Or again, I think that's a great way to look at it, is where's my thinking corrupted? And that doesn't necessarily mean like you're intentionally this bad person, but we're just products of our environment, right? Like you have to be easy with yourself enough to not like be like, oh, I'm a good person, I can't ever think of all the bad things I ever think about, but just maybe give yourself a second to realize, again, where your thinking is corrupted. And that could also be like a big fear thing. Like, something that I really appreciate about, my mom. My mom is very evangelical Christian. We've got a way better relationship now, but she talks a lot about like, don't get me wrong, she's like super, not doomsday, but she's just like, I don't fear this shit. Like, there's nothing to fear about. And I think it's so easy to be in fear. And what's hard as an astrologer is a part of my job is saying, hey, this is what's going to happen in the future. And that could scare a lot of people, but there's no reason for you to fear, right? Like you're going to be taken care of no matter what. Like, have you ever gone? I mean, don't get me wrong. I know some of you have had some very hard lives, but hey, you're here, right? You're watching this on your phone or your computer. How bad has it ever really been? And that's not to say it hasn't, you've had hard times, but you got through them. And so I look at this Mercury Pluto stuff as just like, it's going to be easy to get scared. It's going to be easy to have fear. And there's really no need for it, right? Fear is just a takeaway of your power. And I talk a lot about Pluto being this transmutation of fear and power. Like for me personally, I find so much more, like when I see the state of the world, I can crumble in fear and, hide under my, and do all this stuff. And it's just unnecessary. And I'm bringing all this up because, like, guys, the world is fucking changing over these next 3 years. This shit is not like this whole I just can't emphasize enough how much change is going to happen. And you just can't be afraid of it. You can't live in fear. It does nothing good for you. And it's a takeaway from everybody else. Like, I mean, that's the big thing with, a lot of the, COVID, I don't know what to call them. The people who are very scared of COVID for everything. It's like, don't get me wrong. Like if you're super immunocompromised, which also I think that word was really, abused. But if you're super immunocompromised and you're scared of this, you can't place your fear and project your fear on everybody else because it's not their problem. It really isn't. It's your issue. And if you're super scared, for one, you shouldn't be. You should learn how to control that because that fear and that anxiety and that paranoia literally weakens your immune system, but it doesn't help anybody. When there's critical situations, do you panic? Is panic ever a good thing? No. You have to remain, calm. You have to remain confident, and you've got to push through it. And I know I'm just going off on a kind of a rant here, but this is so important for Mercury conjoining Pluto is like, you can't be scared. Like you just have to and this is a day where you might confront that fear. And I ask you to just, where does the power lie in that? And does the power lie in being afraid, or does the power lie in, being the master of your own fate, the captain of your own ship? So those are the things I would ask you. We get to Saturday. The moon's going to trine Saturn at the late degrees of Libra. It will then enter Scorpio, and it'll square Mercury, which will and then also the moon will conjoin the south node. But Mercury enters Aquarius. Here we go. Are you ready for that last bit of Aquarius stuff? This is when, so the snowball turns into an avalanche by March into April, but this is the beginning of the snowball, is when Mercury enters Aquarius. So let's talk about that. So moon's going to trine Saturn. So it's kind of like, moon and Libra are connections, trining Saturn and Aquarius. We're feeling a lot more, again, I like that for like the kind of connecting with your tribe, connecting with your people sort of thing. Or for example, with Saturn and Aquarius at the end degrees, it's just accepting this shit. You know what I mean? Like, here we are. It is what it is. Moon's going to enter Scorpio. Moon's going to enter Scorpio. And you guys always know what I say is like, it's that your heart's dropping into your stomach. You're like, ugh. And it's also getting really close to the south node here. So there is this, fuck, like there's just kind of like this, that's probably the best way I could describe it. It's just fuck, like, like I have a friend here who's dropping off some stuff because she's moving and she doesn't really know anything about astrology, and she was like, oh, like I'm just, she's trying to find a place to live and X, Y, and Z, and no one said anything's going to happen until March. And I was like, well, if it helps you at all, there's a lot of astrology changes in March. She goes, no. And that's kind of like how I look at this moon south node conjunction. But Mercury goes into Aquarius, and this moon in Scorpio squaring Mercury in Aquarius is a lot. And I've said this before. I'm going to keep saying it. And I'm going to talk about this actually tonight on my Patreon, on my live Ask Me Anything. Someone asked about this, and we're going to go a little bit more into it. There's a lot more information coming out about the mandated medicine that most people were given. More information has come out about that, which is something I've said for the past fucking 2 years now, that this time of Mars retrograde in Gemini, there's a lot more information coming out about that. And this is all relevant to the weekly horoscope here, because as we saw, the lockdowns affected everybody's fucking lives. The mandated inoculation affected everybody's fucking lives. This is not something that's just like, oh, that's just going on in the news. This is all stuff that will probably find its way into your life at some crevice or some corner. But Mercury's going into Aquarius, where when you talk about all this Aquarius stuff, Mercury is now communicating all of that. Mercury is now in its triplicity. Mercury and Saturn love working together. Watch my delineation podcast I did with S.J. Anderson. He goes into this in such great detail about the triplicities and just the Mercury-Saturn stuff. It's a really good podcast. And just watch S.J.'s channel. He's a great astrologer. But this moon in Scorpio is going to make the square to Mercury in Aquarius. Ow, that is not information you want to receive. Mercury in Aquarius is, the Aquarius stuff has been, it's literally doctors, health, society, information, like the internet. Like Saturn Aquarius has always been the internet. And Mercury going into Aquarius is like, our minds are now focused on this. Our minds are now focused on intellect, on, other people, on society as a whole, not just human beings, but society as a whole, mankind, so to say. And on a more personal level, Mercury's in Aquarius, where it's more like Mercury in Aquarius, I've said this too, is very mental gymnastics. Like, it's like, it's just mental gymnastics, which is dumb. Like I just heard this saying, I'm totally going to butcher this, but it's like the most complicated problems will always have the easiest solutions. And then I was just watching this podcast of someone be like, you can't have, like, complicated problems require complicated solutions. And it's just like, what? Like, no, they don't. Most problems can be literally solved quite easily. But that Mercury in Aquarius is very mental gymnastics. How do we jump through all these hoops to get to right here? First it was, take it and, you won't get, COVID. And then it's 90% and then it's 80%. Well, then there's breakthrough and then everyone has it. And then it's, well, you guys know where I'm going. So the moon's going to square Mercury. And there is there's one aspect of it, again, that's on the news. And again, why I'm saying all this too is all this is going to be coming out. Like, the next 2 months is just going to be a shit show on the news. So pay attention to it, I guess, but also don't, get glued to the screen like usual. But the moon going into Scorpio, squaring Mercury in Aquarius is your mind moving into a new place, thinking about things in a new way, but it's hurting your emotions. There's something sensitive about this. There's something that doesn't feel good about this. So I really look at Saturday as like this doesn't feel good. This is not the information I wanted. This is not the way I wanted to see things. And I think that's probably the easiest way to explain it. But Mercury's going into Aquarius, and this is her. And then after that, Mercury goes into Pisces, which is even more of a shit show. But anyway, I think you guys are picking up what I'm putting down. Saturday's looking a little rough. Then we get to Sunday, and the moon's going to go opposite Uranus here, where there is this, again, it's the Uranus stuff. There's this disruption, something that we saw with Uranus and Taurus, which was interesting, was we saw the cattle farmers in the Netherlands have a protest. Like, that's so Uranus and Taurus. We saw these fertilizer shortages, which that was much more of a north node in Taurus and a south node in Scorpio. It was like, because of the war, there was more of this increase in fertilizer, but fertilizer, like nitrogen fertilizer, was shorted. So more people were getting cow manure. So it's very just north node in Taurus, south node in Scorpio. And I'm bringing all this up as like how to think about this, right? Like, Uranus is in Taurus. There's literally been a beef cow farmer protest. Like, it's sometimes extremely literal. And as the moon's in Scorpio, the sign of poop, the sign of manure, it's going opposite it. There is this kind of disruption with the poop supply. That might be a funny way to look at it, but relate that to your own life. It's like, for example, not that long ago, I was telling you guys about, we had a problem with our sewage here that we had to go and, get the augers and clean up all this stuff because there was this cold snap, and it was like disruption in the poop supply. The poop was clogged and disrupted, and we had to unclog the poop. Moon in Scorpio opposite Uranus and Taurus. It's kind of like, this is the best analogy. Are you ready for this? When you put the plunger in the clogged poop toilet and you push it down, right, to get that pressure, and then you put up. Have you ever like pulled up the plunger and like that little divot like just pops and just poop goes everywhere? I mean, that's never happened to me. I've never had that happen before. But if you have had that happen, if you've been so unfortunate, that's like Moon in Scorpio opposite Uranus, just is like, oh, here we go. That's not fun. So Sunday is looking very disruptive. There's an issue. The moon's in Scorpio, right? There's an emotional issue that we have to, kind of focus on, and it's doesn't feel good, but there's something that just kind of pops, that kind of snaps, and it's not like the biggest explosion in the world, right? It's not an eclipse, it's not a full moon, it's just the moon going opposite Uranus. So expect a disruption, expect it to not be that fun and expect to be a little emotionally turbulent and have some turmoil there. But that's this week, guys. Next week is when Jupiter actually leaves shadow and we move on to new territory. Venus conjoins Neptune. It doesn't actually happen on Valentine's Day. It actually happened. Venus is applying to Neptune on Valentine's Day. But that looks both fun and bad. It's like, okay, if you find, like, if you're on Tinder and you meet someone, you might have a really good time, but they might just play you. But it's a fun time. Sun's going to conjoin Saturn. We have the Sun. We have the Saturn Cazimi. This is actually really important for next week. The Sun goes into Pisces, and literally midnight or 11 p.m. on Sunday next week, at the very end of next week, then we have the new moon in Pisces. So it's almost technically in 2 weeks from now. So a lot going on next week. But this week, also last week, I'll have to remember to put the things here. I forgot to put the things here. Anyway. This week is just moving on to new territory. And again, I think the best way to look at this is when the snowball begins of what these next 2 months have in store for us for the rest of February, rest of March, and April, and the rest of the year. But if you have been bored, if you've been waiting for change, you aren't going to wait much longer. Be careful what you wish for. A lot of changes happening in the next year, in the next 4 years, but it really starts now. So with that being said, love and appreciate you guys, and I'll be seeing you next week.